my pleasure to welcome all of you to our Global Partnership Network Public Talk. And today's guest is Professor Praveen Jha from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi in India. And he has completed his PhD at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU in the School of Social Sciences, and is still a professor and chairperson at this very center. And he even was the founding chairperson of the Center for Informal Sector and Labor Studies. And he's been a visiting professor at several universities, and we are lucky to say that University of Kassel is one of them. And so Praveen was a Elabat visiting professor at the International Center for Development and Decent Work. And currently he is Wangari Maathai visiting professor at the Global Partnership, Natural Resources, Public Finance, Education, and the especially relevant is that network and a founding editor of the journal Agrarian South, Journal of Political Economy. So today he's going to give us a lecture entitled Battleground Agriculture, Resistance of Indian Farmers to Neoliberalism. And we are giving this public talk. So Praveen, thanks so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Aram, for your very warm and generous welcome. Your extremely kind words. Let me also convey my greetings to everyone who is present here, and a very warm welcome to all of you in this conversation. As suggested, I'll keep it very brief so that we have more time for discussion and clarification, etc. So the talk is titled as essentially India's farmers against neoliberalism in the context of what I have called battleground agriculture. But it, of course, is not limited only to agriculture, because this has really gone beyond that. And in any case, it has to be that way. So we'll talk about some of those, but let me just begin with some brief remarks on what triggered this very massive and possibly in terms of the scale, intensity, and tenacity of the ongoing protests by India's peasantry, the current struggle would be in the last several decades. I would venture to speculate that at least in half a century, probably we have not seen anything on this scale. In terms of, as I said, the participation, the tenacity, its intensity, and many other aspects that are central to it. So this has drawn considerable attention, both within the country, as you would expect, sure enough, but to some extent also outside India. Of course, outside India, it's been very limited in terms of being analyzed, in terms of being even noticed in many parts of the world and so on. But there is at least some recognition of it in small pockets, bits and pieces, etc., outside the country. Now, let me very briefly flag what were the immediate triggers, and then I'll come to the larger context of what constitutes the core of this very, very profound struggle. As regards the immediate trigger, as it happens, last year, that is in 2020, 3 laws were in a very surreptitious and roundabout manner were announced by the federal government. Now, I'm sure you are aware that India has a federal setup where what is called the central government or the union government or the federal government is in charge of certain domains, whereas the provinces or what we call the states, different states, 29 states, and then we have a few union territories, etc. A whole range of things happen to be in their domain as per the Constitution of India. As it happens, agriculture is one of those things which is in the domain of the states or provinces. Right? The federal government or the union government, central government, whatever you want to call it, decides to intervene in that by using something very different as a provision, which is namely trade. So these are in the nature of trade laws and uses that subterfuge to intervene in something which is primarily, as per India's constitution, in the domain of states policy making. Okay? That too is done in a very weird manner. In June of 2020, these are first passed as ordinances by the union government. As per India's constitution, ordinances can be resorted to by the union government in a situation of emergency. Extremely unusual situation which has come up, and then you pass an ordinance. Otherwise, normally, it should be approved by the parliament, legislated members from all over the country who are called members of parliament. They have to approve it. So in the usual run of things, it is the parliament which has the right, the power, etc., to go ahead with making such changes, and not through the ordinance route, because India was not at war. It was not something which can be considered some kind of emergency and so on. So the way the entire process was handled itself was highly questionable, etc. But let me not get into further details of it. What are the 3 laws? Very briefly, I will not get into great details of it. Let me just call them Law 1, 2, and 3. They're very long names. Okay? Now, the first law, it removes restrictions on processes, agents, and physical procurement for trade in farmers' produce. Earlier, there were lots of restrictions on paper in principle. So, nobody could simply enter that market. Although, in practice, it was widespread. And I'll come to that in a minute. But as per the legal provision mandated by our constitutional arrangements, it was within the domain of a particular body which would facilitate these trades in farmers' produce. Now the law says that, okay, we will do away with that, anyone can do so. I'm simplifying things, but that's law 1. Right? Then we have law 2, which seeks to create an architecture and legal framework for contract farming, which again would be leaving things to the market, right? And the apprehension of the farmers was that this would result into doing away with, again, something which is on paper, not strictly implemented, that is minimum support price for the produce. Right? So the fear was that that would be done away with, and anyone, and what do farmers apprehend when they think of anyone who might enter in farming through contracts? Basically corporate entities. That is their fear. So this is the crux of Law 2. And Law 3, it reconstitutes the list of what is known as essential commodities by removing several important products out of the list, which had been there till then. For instance, cereals, pulses, edible oils, oil seeds, potato, onion, and many others from that list of essential commodities. Now, basically, this provision of essential commodities ensured that the government could intervene anytime, can regulate prices if there is, let's say, an inflationary spike, or if there are all kinds of wrongdoings which is being perceived, then this law can be invoked. Now, if you take all these three laws together, right, and as I said, I'm not getting into many very important details. If there are questions, then we can come back to it. Fundamentally, what is being done? If you take all these three things together, essentially, it is a major kind of contestation, what I like to call and see as a laissez-faire capitalism versus regulated capitalism. Right? So the provisions that we had, at least on paper, were trying to ensure that capitalism is kept in check. It, ensures that certain kinds of tendencies are regulated, etc. Again, most of the provisions were on paper, and it had a very, very sort of different kind of experience in different parts of the country. As you know, India is more of a continent than a country, our population is 1.38 billion, sort of more than almost 3 times the size of Europe, as you know. So given all this, massive diversity across the country is something which was to be expected. Right? So we can get into some of those issues and concerns later, but fundamentally, whatever provisions existed as legal architecture promised a kind of regulated capitalism in agriculture as elsewhere. Okay? The idea through these acts, which were passed first as ordinances and then later approved by the parliament in September of last year, the idea is to move much closer to a kind of free market capitalism. Okay? And this is what has created a massive angst within farmers at large. Right? And when I say farmers, we are not talking only of the top end of India's farmers, but every segment of the farming community, including agricultural laborers. Right? So that's the brief backdrop. Right? So what are the farmers demanding? They're demanding that all 3, what they call black laws, should be repealed, abrogated. And in addition, they are asking that there should be a legal provision for minimum support price. So India had a provision for minimum support price, but that was not a legal guarantee. From 1965, the country has had a provision for minimum support, right? But as I said, it was never a legal guarantee. Right? That is one of the reasons why barely, as per different estimates, 6 to 9% of farmers are covered, 6 to 9% of total farmers, and we are now talking only of farmers, not of course agricultural laborers, who were covered by this minimum support price, which basically means that almost 90%, more than 90% of the farmers in any case were never covered by it. Barely 25 to 30% of total produce in major cereals, in particular paddy, wheat, maize, and outside cereals, it is sugarcane, which got covered through this minimum support provision. Almost all of this was massively located in northwestern part of the country, which has been a kind of what you could describe as the bowl of green revolution in India. This is where green revolution started in late 1960s, 70s, 80s. 80s, it spreads to many other parts of the country. Almost it becomes pan-Indian, right? But the extent of the coverage in terms of minimum support provisions, etc., remained limited in large measure to northwestern part of the country. However, in tiny pockets here and there, it is also available in many other states, because there it depended on whether the state governments wanted to take it further or not. Right? So that's the kind of context of the immediate trigger. These laws, farmers are saying that, look, you have to basically take back these laws. These protests are still massively sort of mobilized in some parts of India, northwestern part, because there they had also experienced the advantages of regulated capitalism. So by and large, the support is there. Other parts of the country, in particular Eastern India, it's very, very limited. Part of the reason is that they never had any serious attempt to apply these erstwhile provisions, acts, etc. Right? So for those reasons, there was very little benefit that they had experienced. So the mobilization also is far more difficult. Nonetheless, it is indeed a pan-Indian movement. Right? So it differs from province to province, state to state, but at least in about 10 to, let's say, 15 states, you find that there is a very, very strong kind of support for it. Of course, in differentiated manner, 3-4 states happen to be extremely mobilized, the peasantry in those states, but in other places you have a kind of. So hopefully this has given you a kind of a backdrop of the immediate trigger. Point 2, as it happens, this trigger comes in a context of a prolonged agrarian crisis, or the crisis in the countryside, during the neoliberal phase, which started in early 90s in India in a very concerted manner. The process started roughly in 80s, but in very slow and incremental ways. It is 1990s, in particular July of 91, that it was like a storm. Yeah, a whole range of what we associate with structural adjustment program, right, and stabilization. World Bank and IMF driven these sort of major kind of packages. Yeah, these get unleashed in July 91, and subsequently it has been an acceleration of that till recently. Now, what happened because of this? India got into progressively more and more serious kind of difficulty in agriculture. Right? Now, some of us like to call it agrarian crisis. Some sort of basically think of it not as an all-out crisis, but a kind of very depressed situation. We can disagree on some of those things. But the fact that agriculture has been under tremendous pressure during the last roughly 30 years, and much more so in the last roughly 7 years or so, right, is evident from all indicators. What is the single most important indicator that people have talked about? Farmers killing themselves almost as a most desperate act of protest. Right? And we are talking of more than 400,000 farmers, who have killed themselves during the last roughly 20 odd years. Starting 97, from when we have all this data, right? So more than 400,000 farmers. Okay? As it happens, the definition of farmer in India is very limited. So this number is an underestimate. So women who do not have title to land are not counted as farmers. Right? Is the head of the household who has, let's say, the title to land. So his sons, if they kill themselves, they would not be counted as part of the farmer suicide and so on. Right? So this is a very dramatic and possibly unprecedented. Probably we don't have a comparable number anywhere in the world in peacetime. Yeah, of course, people got killed in war and so on. But in peacetime, you will not come across this kind of number anywhere in the world. Right? If you look at other indicators, for instance, per capita income, what is happening to it, etc., very serious situation. In fact, if we look at, let's say, 2011-12 and 18-19, and this is a period of almost 6 years, yeah? In independent India, that is since 1947, you will not come across a period of 5 to 6 years where the per capita consumption of agricultural households or rural households, taking both agriculture and non-agriculture in the countryside, in rural areas, has declined on any significant scale. So we had, in one particular year, it could have been the case that there is a small increase, small decline, but over a period of more than 5 years, for the first time since, almost 75 years, since around 1950 or so, we have a situation where per capita consumption declined by almost 9 percentage points. India is not contracting. India is indeed growing. I'm talking of this period just before Corona. Right? So we are not talking of the Corona crisis. Right? So 6 years before that, you have a situation where the country continues to be the second fastest growing economy in the world after China. Right? In fact, over this entire period, India has been the second fastest growing economy in the world. That is, in almost 35 to 40 years, India has been the second fastest growing economy in the world after China. The gap between, of course, India and China for this entire period is significant, noticeable, roughly, almost 40% or so. If China has grown annually at a rate of 9 to 10%, India has grown at a rate of roughly 5.5 to 6% or so. So yes, there is a gap between the two, but over this entire period, it is indeed the case. Where is this growth going? Who is it going to? What is happening to the peasantry? What is happening to the countryside? Right? And as I said, if you look at 6 years just before Corona crisis, you have a situation where per capita income actually is going down. Per capita consumption is going down. Right? And we are talking of consumption, which is, for the overwhelming majority, we are talking of being on the margins of survival. 40-50% of the population is barely on the margin of survival. Right? So by any decent reckoning in terms of what generally we consider poverty benchmark, almost 2/3 of the population would be below that. So if you look at multidimensional poverty and so on, so there are all those challenges, but let me not get into these details. Likewise, if you look at the third indicator, the gap between per capita income or consumption in urban areas and non-agriculture, and take the counterpart in agriculture, the gap has been widening, which would be obvious from what we have discussed so far. Right? So 1980s, roughly it was, the ratio was 1:2, 1:2.5. Now it is almost 1:6, 1:6.5, 1:7, in that region. If you, again, the estimates differ, but then roughly at least a trebling of the gap, right? Where the situation in agriculture and rural areas has been in a very difficult situation, difficult context, right? So that was my second argument, locating the anger, the angst, etc., in the larger context of neoliberal capitalism. Right? In that, especially after 2017, the farmers started mobilizing themselves on a noticeable and significant scale. This was after killing of farmers in police firing in a province called Madhya Pradesh in 2017. So 5 farmers were killed. Right? And then that sort of brings a lot of organizations together under a broad rubric, which was earlier called Kisan Sangharsh Coordination Committee. Now it is called Sanyukt Morcha, that is Joint Forum. And more than 250 farmers organizations are part of it. From left to many on the right, except the one which is connected with the ruling party. Almost all other organizations are part of this joint forum. Right? 2017 onwards, it has been a sustained thing all through. Of course, the last 15 months or so, it's been very noticeable, heightened, and so on and so forth. Right? But, almost on a continuous basis, we have seen this from 2017. Right? So, neoliberalism is at the root of it. Neoliberalism is at the center of it. Right? What are the most obvious correlates of it? I think here in this conversation, I'm sure each one of you knows very well the major policy correlates of neoliberalism. Right? One is compression of public expenditure, public investment, and so on. So overall macroeconomic regime, macro policy regime, fiscal regime, etc. Now that creates huge challenges. And apart from that, this opening up of any national economy to the global context, which leads to massive fluctuations. And because of those fluctuations in prices and income, etc., massive vulnerabilities. These are, there are a whole lot of other correlates, as I said, but then we can sort of not get into the details. I'm sure all of you are aware of it. I can give you lots of numbers if you want. What has happened to per capita investment in agriculture and expenditure and so on and so forth. Right? But that is the broad kind of context in terms of understanding the long period and the explanations for that long period. Right? And the explanations, if I put it in one sentence, I would call it neoliberalism. That is at the center of the policy correlates, etc. I noticed that we are sort of struggling in terms of time, so let me not give you too many numbers. Right? Let me come to the last point in this context. Yeah. If you look at the world at large, at the global economic system at large, it is impossible in any country to leave the market forces to unleash whatever they have on agriculture, right? And not see such deadly outcomes across the world, right? As it happens, if you look at where we are sitting right now, center of European Union, right? Or if you look at US and so on, the annual subsidy for agriculture is in Europe approximately slightly more than 100 billion euros, right? Likewise in the US. Now, this is divided into two parts. One, direct income support to farmers and a whole range of subsidies. As it happens, if you look at estimates of support and subsidy, there are lots of methodological challenges, right? In case of India, if you go by OECD estimates, in fact, it shows a negative number. But that is because of the methodology. So let me not get into details of the methodology. If you are interested, then we'll talk about it later, right? But all these parts of the world where farmers and agriculture seem to be at least somewhat better off, okay? You find that the state takes care of them, right? They have also been left to the logic of the market, and the corporates have more or less captured agriculture everywhere. That has happened. That has happened in the US, that has happened in Europe, that has happened in China, right? But these countries, these parts of the world have found ways of somehow addressing some needs of farmers. As I said, through two mechanisms, direct income support and through subsidies of various kinds. As it happens, some of you might be surprised to know that China currently is the biggest subsidizer to agriculture. 212 billion US dollars, twice as much as Europe, or approximately Europe or US. But also, it is because China is much bigger. It's also because of the fact that the dependency on agriculture there is obviously much higher, right? We still have more than 25% of the population directly engaged in agriculture, drawing their livelihoods and so on and so forth. Okay? So this was my last point, that if farmers and agriculture have to be given some succor, some support, state has to be a direct and significant and powerful player. In spite of that, if you look at in the US, suicides amongst farmers, very tiny segment of the population, is 45% higher than the general rate of suicide in the USA. In spite of that support, something is going on, something is very worrisome, right? If you look at the relevant literature and so on, yeah, what the farmers are feeling in terms of being cast aside, thrown aside, etc., the concerns are very serious. In spite of the fact that in per capita terms, per capita farmers, it is almost 50,000 USD annually, which goes to keep them functioning and alive and so on and so forth. Right? In short, a return to laissez-faire anywhere in the world is a recipe for disaster. Right? Now, earlier I said last point, but let me just add one more point. Actually, all these connect very powerfully with the academic discourses, and there is a large literature on this, on the resolution of the agrarian question. Right? What happened, and particularly in Marxian political economy, there is a huge literature on this. Right? The Eurocentric or Western-centric or Northern-centric, whichever way you want to put it, right? There's this whole thing that people will be, in due course of transition, economic transformation, move from agriculture to industry to service sector and so on. It's all for the good. Everyone will be happier than before, etc., right? And if that happens, then agrarian transition would have happened, agrarian question would have been resolved, etc. Far from it. Global South, there is just no way that you will see this kind of transition. That has been a kind of claim which I and some of my colleagues, some other scholars have been putting forth on the table now for last 15, 20 years or so. Right? So how do we link the issue of farmers' agitation in India, the struggle in India, with the questions of macro policy regime, and finally to the whole prospects of resolution of the agrarian question? All these are linked in very important ways, in organic ways. These are not disconnected. Right? Thank you very much for your attention.